Hi friends, so this is part 2 of mixing greens from a primary palette. Right now I'm on the Huckaby trail over by Midgley Bridge, just next to Oak Creek, and just gonna paint these beautiful rolling hills with that lovely atmosphere. A little bit of red rock at the top too, of course. So hope you enjoy this video and hope that the greens have, you know, a new context in the landscape and that you learn a couple things. So I'm starting with this horizontally formatted 8x10 panel that I believe is a primed ampersand gesso board, and you can see that I'm really quickly just blocking in my sketch here with the alizarin crimson and a tiny little bit of ultramarine blue. I've really tried to achieve a strong sense of the foreground, middle ground, and background masses, and just capturing the curvature of some of those planes as they add kind of a dynamic interest, especially with that amazing diagonal I have running down the painting. And now I'm just really thinly, with a lot of Gamsol mineral spirits, blocking in this lighter value, and it's going to be my greenest green. So it's ultramarine blue with cad red medium and cad red yellow. It's going to be dominating with cad red yellow. And now I'm blocking in the shadow area in the next tier of the hillside, which has a little more blue. I believe I used alizarin crimson instead of the cad medium, or I used a little bit of alizarin crimson with cad red light, a little bit of that cad medium again for some of the highlights, but I'm using more of the red and blue. As you recede, typically yellow is the first color to drop out of our perception, then red, and then you're left with more of the blues. So that's just a very basic way of kind of learning how to apply your color mixtures with a landscape that has a lot of depth in it. And with this block in of my value and colors, I'm just keeping it super thin so I can kind of adjust into it, but I'm not sure how long this light is going to stay. So it's going to help me to see what needs to be the light and the dark values, because that's really kind of what attracted me to the scene, is this really interesting light pattern with the sun being low in the sky. And if you look at those red rocks, you can see they are much cooler as the plane is slanted, and they're appearing to be warmer and a little bit, you know, more contrast even as they're upright. So on the hill there, I've added a little bit more yellow and blue into my red rock mixture. Definitely titanium white, because it's all generally more of a middle value because of how far away it is in the scene. As you recede, the values get closer together, meaning there's less contrast. And then adding in those highlights will give you a strong sense of contrast still without it, wanting to move too forward in this scene here. So pretty clearly you can see the illustration of temperature, how those rocks go from cooler to warmer. So definitely, a little more alizarin with ultramarine blue and the cad medium. And then for the upright cliffs, there's a little bit more cad red light. And I basically just added a little more of titanium white and yellow to create those highlights on the rock. But making sure that I never use too much white or yellow, because then it kind of feels unnatural. So really trying to gauge, these tonal relationships, because as planes recede, they also lose saturation. And there's this component that you'll run into a lot with plein air, where you have these rules in mind, but then, if you look at those greens that are getting blasted by sunlight in the background, they feel warmer than the greens on the hillside that's closer up front. So how do you manage that? Which is an interesting conversation. So I definitely want that to be read as a little bit warmer, but also not to compete with that second tier of the hillside. And definitely I'm adding a lot more ultramarine blue and a little bit of titanium white with this plane that is the green that's the furthest back. And I'm not going to get over fussy about, adding all of that vegetation in between the rocks. It's important to keep in mind that when we're capturing fleeting light like this and, attempting to make these sometimes complex drawings and decisions, mixing colors, it's really important not to get caught up in the details that we're seeing. So even though this may feel, a bit more unfinished to me when I finish it, it has all the information that I need to take it back in the studio or make some refining touches. But yeah, with plein air, the details always go last. So my job right now is just to capture what I'm seeing with the light, and I can decide to, refine it as much as I want, if it's lingering, or, I've painted it thinly enough in some areas where if it does change dramatically, I can say, oh, okay, that's more interesting, and kind of work with that too. But that's another component. Once you've laid in your major value pattern, you don't really, want to change the light that you have going on after that, because then you'll just create kind of a mess. Directional brush marks are also really important. You can see for the trees, I'm doing a lot of upright mark making. And then, for the ground plane, I do more horizontal mark making. And that directs the, viewer's mind into that three-dimensional space of, what feels flat and what feels tall, upright, rounded. So these are all decisions that you're also making with the direction of your brush marks. So, every thing that you're doing in plein air is a decision, essentially. And there's still a lot of work to be done on this foreground hillside, but I really quickly just want to block in the furthest cliff, which doesn't need to be there, but I think it gives it more context. And I'm really pushing those blues because it is the farthest receding cliff. So you can see, I have maybe 4 zones of green, and they go from more yellow to more red leaning to more blue leaning. And that's why I chose this dynamic scene, because I really felt like you could see, how much you can push green in a landscape. And, greens are going to be different, obviously, in the high desert versus, on the beach or in the forest. So this is very particular to this landscape, the dryness and the colors. And for my sky mixture, it's very light, so I've added a little cerulean and titanium white, a touch of that, red rock color to kind of desaturate a little. I'll probably add a little bit of cad lemon yellow because you can see that it is lighter and warmer towards the horizon there. So I want to give that sense of the sky gradient as well. A lot of painters won't put in the sky actually when they're painting because, that's not something that's fleeting that, you necessarily need to capture. But for me, it really gives the painting a sense of space, and it kind of shows me where I can push contrast or chroma, that sort of thing. So it really helps to see the painting as a whole and make adjustments accordingly. Adding a little more of a gray into that ridge line. So again, I don't even think that you need to be finessing that background cliff. It could easily just be like a swatch of that first blue that I put down. And kind of lowering that line a little so that it doesn't create a tangent by being the same height as any aspect of that red rock feature. Now that shadow is creeping up on that big lit up hillside. But there are still darks there. So because I painted so thinly, I can really just go in with thicker paint and create those shadow shapes of the trees that the trees are casting on the hillside. So you're getting these long shadows too on the ground plane that are kind of like a magical, like purpley color, against the red rock. And again, making sure that I have more yellow in my mixtures because it's the foreground. Also really leaning into that contrast because the things that are closer are always going to have stronger values. So darker darks and lighter lights. And it's a general rule of thumb to paint your darkest darks first if you have some really dark pieces in there, and then go in with your middle value lights, and then final stage here will be just dropping in those highlights. And this is one of those decisions that may or may not have supported the painting, but the very top of that hillside, there's kind of a natural clearing that was lit up when I first got to the site. And I thought that that would be kind of a nice entry for the viewer to kind of zigzag into the painting. But it's a little bit of an awkward shape, so I'll continue to refine it, and it's now in shadow anyways, and I don't actually think it really needs to be there, but maybe I can refine it a little and still keep a sense of, you know, that tree line splitting up so that you can enter into the painting a bit more. But calming down that highlight that I added with some middle values. And you can just see how, you know, that shadow is that's just coming up, and this is real time. So I, you know, am laying in those strong ground plane shadows. I want to get all my shadows kind of down, and then I'll go in with the lights. And this is one of those scenarios where, you know, there are a lot of shapes happening, like with a hillside. So how much do you articulate those shapes, and how much do you leave it to be just like a mass, you know, a group mass? It was easier in the beginning when more of it was in light. But now there's definitely more shadow areas. So now it's time to just, you know, quickly drop in that pattern of that direct sunlight hitting those trees on that foreground hillside. And with this time of day, that light is, I would say, you know, kind of an orangey yellow. So it's also important not to get, you know, too light on your mask that you've created in the foreground, because that body, if you will, still needs to feel natural, like it has, you know, a mother value scheme happening. So even though the light is really directly hitting this area, I've still got somewhat of a middle value light that's very orangey yellow. And it continues to get more orange as the sun gets lower in the sky. So mixing the cad red yellow with cad red medium, making sure that I still have some ultramarine blue to keep the feeling of green. And deciding where I want to group some of these trees together and where I want to kind of have them standing off by themselves. Because you really do, you have these irregular patches of trees. And, you know, the more that this hillside is lit, the more that it feels kind of not sparse, but, you know, it's not just a covered mass. There's those shadows that meet the ground plane, and then the ones that the trees are casting on the vegetation behind them. So that has a context in and of itself. There's definitely a lot of warmth and more darkness as the tree meets the ground plane. So you want to be mindful of creating that gradient, that natural gradient from dark to light. And obviously the light from the background vegetation has vanished. So that's also another thing to keep in mind when you're plein air painting. Trying to map the sun, the arc of the sun, have an idea of maybe what the light will do, and paint the most fleeting areas first. And you can see that's what I've done here. I had a block in where I put down the general idea, but I really tried to paint those areas that I felt were going to be the most fleeting. And I could have worked on the highlights in the background clips a bit more, but you know, there weren't much there. I thought it was interesting how, you know, there was kind of very little sunlight on this interesting shape back there. And like I said, you know, this sketch is really about taking something that feels pretty complex and reducing it down to kind of the main ideas. And a lot of plein air painting is not going out and creating a finished masterpiece. Most of it is actually just trying to understand the light and record your observations. So, you know, even though I'm not working on a sketchbook, that's how a lot of these panels feel. They feel like me working through ideas. And it's great when you create a painting that feels really solid and finished, but a lot of times they're just studies. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.